Alrighty. Okay, so welcome to another Metalogix Quick Take. So this is the series where we try to take a little small bite-sized section of one of the tools, in this case SharePoint Backup, and extrapolate on that concept to give the viewer some insight into a particular section or function of the tool, whether it be a particular problem issue or how something gets configured or something along those lines. Today's going to be a little bit different in that first of all, my name is Roy Martinez. Most of you have probably met me, but I'm the lead support representative and sales engineer for SharePoint Backup and Diagnostic Manager. I've got quite a few years of experience working with this tool since its original inception, and I've kind of seen it grow and respond to customer demand over the years. So I've kind of seen it all, and I'm excited to share a lot of this insight and expertise with you. But today what we're talking about is a little bit of a departure. So rather than focus on a specific problem area or a specific concept, I just want to talk about what's new in the 5.1 release that we put out there on the 28th of August. So Backup has been growing over the years, and in this meeting, I just want to highlight a couple of the changes to some of the functionality in the tool, with a focus specifically on how we fit into existing disaster recovery strategies. So if you just want to look over here. So what we're going to cover is, as I said, specifically fitting SharePoint Backup into an existing SQL Server disaster recovery strategy, right? Ways that we can leverage native backup files, ways that we can leverage raw data files, or even link to live content databases if that were the preferred case. And we'll talk about different potential use cases for each of those concepts, reasons why you might want to use this approach as opposed to another. And then once we've had that discussion, we're going to talk about some of the new options for native SQL alternatives that we've added to the tool in this latest release, specifically options for mounting a full or differential backup, and then options for mounting from transaction log backups to give us this kind of point-in-time recovery that wasn't quite as available in the last releases. So without further ado, let me go ahead and remove that. Let's go ahead and close that. I don't want to restart. But as we can see here, we have SharePoint Backup. And as we're, I'm going to leave the tool up, but let's just have a quick talk about disaster recovery in general and why we might want to use the tool in this way as opposed to having our tool. I mean, as you know, out of the box, the kind of advertised functionality is kind of a one-stop shop where you can back up everything, restore everything, and get granular restoration capabilities from a single tool. And that is still the primary focus of what SharePoint Backup offers, a way for the SharePoint administrative team to manage the backup and restoration of the farm components in their environment, i.e. their databases, their SharePoint Hive, their .NET configurations, et cetera, at the component level from a high level. And this is definitely a disaster recovery strategy concept, being able to back up those core components and be able to restore them at a moment's notice. But and we do offer that. It does offer that again, one-stop shop concept. Everything managed here, one backup set to rule them all, use the same backup set to mount for granular restore, et cetera, et cetera. But the larger the enterprise, obviously the more kinks in the chain, so to speak. And one thing that we see as we scale is that we're leveraging volume shadow copy behind the scenes, and volume shadow copy is a Microsoft technology used for snapshotting different components. And in our case, we're snapshotting these specific components. And databases are one of those. And with VSS or any database backup concept, there is potential to kind of step on the feet of any native policies in place. Example, if in my SQL Server I have, and I do not, but if I had a management or a maintenance policy set to backup database, let's say any of my content databases. Let's say that I'm backing up my content databases I'm doing fulls every Sunday night, and then Monday through Friday I'm doing differentials with transaction log backups happening every 15 minutes, a very complex schedule that applies to all the databases on the instance, including my content databases. Well, if that were the case, when I come into my backup tool and I plan to do my own differential and hold my own schedule for my own backup set, well, then I stand to potentially interrupt the LSN chain managing that schedule in native SQL. And long story short, to keep it simple and brief, we could interrupt that chain and cause those backups to fail ultimately. Now, obviously, we've implemented measures to circumvent that by allowing you to do a so-called copy-only backup that'll take a full backup that doesn't include LSN information to break that chain. Of course, you're limited to the full in such a case. So again, without getting too deep into it, there are options, but it limits us in what our capabilities are, specifically in the fact that we wouldn't be able to take fulls and differentials using our tool if you've already got a maintenance policy scheduled in your native SQL Server instance, right? So there's definitely a back and forth. And the same is true going the opposite direction. If I've got a full and differential scheduled in my tool in Metalogix Backup, well, whenever I implement backups in the SQL side, I stand to interrupt those schedules, and thusly our differentials, rather than fail, will just escalate to full, increasing storage size and or the size of the backup sets, and potentially causing some headaches in the future when you're talking about storage capacity planning, right? So both directions, there is a little bit of gray area wherein we have some potential to cause some problems. So as an alternative to that approach, and again, we're speaking specifically about environments and enterprises wherein there is an existing SQL Server DBA managed disaster recovery policy in place. You know, the database team has their procedures in place for managing these databases, and now we're coming in as SharePoint administrators and kind of introducing new variables and, you know, causing potential headaches in that regard. So we've opened up the tool a little bit to give us some leverage in, rather than reinvent the wheel, so to speak, in terms of how these policies are made up, we've made the tool a little bit more versatile into how he will fit into existing disaster recovery strategies. So if we take the example of our DBA team has just one maintenance policy to rule them all that's backing up all these databases on a full differential and transaction log schedule. Well, rather than us go into our tool and you know, create extra work and essentially a redundant schedule that backs up those same databases full only and gives us, you know, single points in time to deal with, why not leverage those existing SQL backups? Why not just back up the non-database components to give us the full fidelity of the disaster recovery picture at the highest level? In other words, giving us the .NET Framework config, the SharePoint registry, all those little bits and bobs that we need in order to rebuild our farm, and just let SQL handle the database backups. There's already a process in place. Why make things more difficult for ourselves? And one way we can do that is by extending our capabilities in the granular restore side. So it all boils down to, with this tool, can I restore a single document from a list, from a library, from this, from that, right? And we've got this concept of mounting, wherein we take our database backup, we mount it, or essentially kind of virtualize it or set it up as a temporary database, and then we mine data from that mounted database as if it were SharePoint, right? And this is the example, right? So I'm drilling into the hierarchy, reading a mounted database as it exists on my SQL Server instance, right? So this is the mount concept in its basis premise. And we want to extend that to native SQL functionality. Now, we already had the ability to mount native SQL.bak files, and it was a little bit limited in that it was only available in regard to full backups, right? So we could mount full native backups, but we've extended that capability now. And as you'll see in my mount wizard, any of you who are familiar with mounting databases might see some familiarity here, but we've reordered this list a little bit. But as you can see here, in addition to selecting my own Metalogix proprietary backup set format, I can obviously select a SQL Server backup file, and that includes full backups, differential backups, and transaction log backups. I can select raw SQL Server data and log files. In other words, if I have pre-staged data files from a database from a point in time, depending on how your retention policies work, if you have the raw data files somewhere, we can certainly just connect directly to those, mount them up and stage them, or really just attach them as a database in SQL instance. And then, of course, obviously the SharePoint full farm backup capability is still there, and the ability to link to a live content database. Now, this is a little bit oft overlooked, but I mean, it's a potentially powerful feature depending on how your environment is set up. But imagine an environment wherein we have a kind of redundancy SQL Server mirrored, for instance, as archaic as that seems these days. But let's say there's a secondary farm, a warm standby, if you will, with replicated information for redundancy. For instance, if you're using the replicator tool, for instance, and we're replicating data from farm A to farm B to make a mirror to keep redundancy and availability up, perhaps something got deleted from farm A that we know exists in farm B, well, we can link to the congruent content database in farm B, mine the information we need out of it, and restore it back to farm A. So this is the concept behind link. But beyond that, focusing on the SQL Server stuff, if we go next here, obviously we get the option to select the instance to which we're going to be mounting. This can be any SQL instance as usual, as long as we have a backup service to interface with it. You can really pick any SQL instance you want. It doesn't have to be your SharePoint SQL instance. But when we click next, this is where we get the cool new features. So we've got two ways now to identify backup sets, and I'm gonna apologize in advance because just prior to the meeting earlier this morning, I realized that my SQL Server was in simple recovery mode, so I wasn't able to set up any transaction log backups to look at. But hopefully the theory and the concept will be fresh in your mind, and your imaginations will allow you to kind of picture it. But we have two concepts now. So browse directly to backup files is just like the original functionality. We're literally going to use this. This should look a lot like what you'd see in SQL Server, and we're just going to browse to the UNC path where those backups may exist. In my case, that's the backups directory, and select your BAK file. And in the case of striped backs or striped differentials, you'd select all the different backup files relevant. In the case of a transaction log backup, however, you'd have to select the transaction log you're interested in, all previous transaction logs relevant to that one, and its relevant full. So you can imagine that could get tricky depending on how things are stored and how much data you have to sift through. If you're looking to hit a transaction log from midday that was maybe 16th in line that day, and the full is from a week prior, well, you could see how you might have a lot of things to sift through. So we've implemented a cool little search feature, and this is the preferred method, by the way. Obviously, you could stand to miss a transaction log in this, but by using this search feature, we now give you a cool little wizard that will actually tell you what's out there. So if we know the name of the backup set, we can filter by that. Leaving it blank, we'll just enumerate all. We give the date range for when the backup may have occurred and what type it is. I'm going to include all. Again, I won't show any transaction logs, but just for giggles, as you can see, it shows me now all the .bak files relevant to this instance. Now I could specify the instance or just all SQL instances relevant to this installation. Shows me all the backup files relevant to that instance. If I had transaction logs, it would list them in a nested hierarchy, and I could literally just select the one single transaction log I'm interested in, and the tool will automatically associate all the relevant trans logs, differentials, and or backups that are relevant to that particular point in time for you. One click, and you're off to the races. Again, I deeply apologize that I don't have transaction logs to illustrate that point, but that's on me, and I'll have to re-record this session later for you all. But as you can imagine, we just see that list here, select the transaction log we want, and everything is hunky-dory. Everything is handled behind the scenes, right? So the point here is it makes it easy for us to identify the set we want to mount, and furthermore, it opens up that alternative. Right now we can get into the transaction logs and see literally, normally transaction logs are done on I think it's like a 15-minute basis is the best practice or whatever, right? So you can really get pretty accurate points in time for high criticality content. So that's kind of the idea behind this. And then the rest of this is just basically the same. We've got a couple of new little bells and whistles. Now we can actually control the name that the mounted database shows as in the SQL instance. For instance, if I know it's for content database X, I just want to make sure it's understood that it's a mount, so I can identify it easily within the instance. That's great. And then here we can actually define where that database is going to be hosted from. So it's possible that we're attaching databases to SQL instances here and SQL instances there. At the end of the day, there has to be a data file somewhere, right? So in the old days, by default, we would host from our backup set location, and we'd have situations wherein we'd be adding data to that storage location, even temporarily. Maybe that's not an ideal scenario, depending on your capacity limitations, but at any rate, we've added the ability to actually define where it is we stage those data files. So the default is to just use whatever the SQL Server instance is configured for the default path for data files. That's where they get stored. Usually that's defined by, it's like if you look at where the model database is storing its files, that's typically where the default is, but you can always look in your SQL instance properties to identify where the default staging path would be. In my case, it would be somewhere in here in the C program files root directory. But yeah, we can set up as many managed paths as we want within our tool, under tools preferences, to give us options as to where to stage those data files. And then if the backup sets themselves are encrypted, we can include those encryption passwords here, whether it's a password on the backup set or the media within. Remember, .bak files can host multiple backup types within, fulls, diffs, translogs, all in one single BAK, and they could all have separation of backups in that respect. Beyond that, everything else is pretty self-explanatory and same as it was. But I hope that makes some sense and gives you an indication of how things are kind of expanding in terms of how SharePoint Backup, Metalogix Backup can fit into an existing disaster recovery schedule that leverages native SQL Server backup. So at this point, we've got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to open up the floor to questions. If anyone has any specific questions, please fire them out at me, and I'll be happy to address those as they come in. And if not, we can have a short session. One thing I guess I can, let's see. Yeah, otherwise the mounts will obviously operate identically to any other. Once a database is mounted, no matter what the source was, the end result is always the same within the tool. We're browsing that hierarchically as though it were SharePoint data, and restoring content the same way. So, okay, I don't see any questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and consider this a complete meeting and move to adjourn. But as usual, and as is always the case, if there are any specific questions you have for us, feel free to shoot us an email, call us up at 202-609-9100, or go to the portal and log your questions, feedback, etc. via that Metalogix portal. And yeah, we invite you to download the latest release and start playing with these options if they're applicable or relevant to your scenario, and let us know what you think. Otherwise, I thank everyone for joining us today, and have a fantastic day.